Most people think honesty is a choice, until it costs them everything. The rain had been falling for hours, steady and cold, the kind that soaked through fabric and settled deep into your bones, turning every step into a quiet battle, and under the dim flicker of a streetlight on the edge of a nearly empty block, Chloe Bennet stood with her arms wrapped around herself, her thin jacket offering little protection against the chill as water dripped from her dark hair and traced lines down her face. But she barely noticed it anymore, because when you'd been sleeping on benches and bus stops long enough, discomfort stopped being something you reacted to and became something you simply carried, like a second skin, and tonight was no different, just another long walk through a city that never slowed down long enough to see her, until something caught her eye, a shape half hidden near the curb, just beside a parked black sedan so polished it reflected the streetlight like glass, and for a second she thought it was trash, just another forgotten piece of someone else's life, but something about it felt off, deliberate almost, and she hesitated, glancing around the empty street, the distant hum of traffic the only sound, before taking a cautious step closer, her worn sneakers splashing lightly in a shallow puddle, and then she saw it clearly, a wallet, dark leather, expensive even at a glance, lying just far enough from the car door to make it look accidental, and Chloe's breath caught slightly as she bent down, her fingers hovering over it for a moment. As if it might disappear, or worse, belong to someone watching, but the street remained quiet, indifferent, and slowly, she picked it up, the weight of it heavier than she expected, solid, real, and when she opened it, just enough to see inside, her heart stuttered, because there it was, crisp bills folded neatly, more cash than she had seen in weeks, maybe months, tucked alongside a driver's license and a sleek black credit card. And for a moment, just one small moment, everything inside her went still, the cold, the hunger, the exhaustion, all of it paused as her mind raced through possibilities, food that didn't come from a shelter line, a motel room with heat, a chance to sleep somewhere safe for once, and her fingers tightened around the leather as the rain continued to fall, tapping softly against the pavement like a clock counting down, and she swallowed hard, glancing over her shoulder again, the street still empty, no voices calling out, no footsteps approaching, nothing but silence, and yet something about it didn't feel like silence, it felt like waiting, like the city itself was holding its breath, watching to see what she would do next, and Chloe exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air as she looked back down at the wallet, her thumb brushing over the edge of the license, catching the name for just a second before she closed it again, pressing it shut as if sealing away the temptation inside, and she shook her head slightly, almost laughing under her breath at herself, because of course it would be this kind of night, the kind where the one thing that could change everything just happened to land in her hands, and still, she knew, deep down, before she even said it out loud, what she was going to do. It's not mine, she murmured quietly, her voice barely audible over the rain, as if saying it made it real, made it final, and she tucked the wallet carefully into the inner pocket of her jacket, holding it close not as something she owned, but as something she was responsible for, and she turned back toward the street, scanning for the address on the license in her memory, already mapping out the walk in her head, even though it would probably take over an hour, even though her stomach ached and her shoes were soaked and every step would be harder than the last, because some part of her, the part that refused to disappear no matter how hard life pressed against her, still believed that doing the right thing mattered, even when no one was watching, especially then. And as she stepped off the curb and into the dim stretch of sidewalk ahead, she didn't notice the faint glint of a camera lens hidden behind the tinted window of the black sedan, didn't see the subtle shift of a shadow in the driver's seat, or the quiet glow of a screen illuminating a pair of sharp, focused eyes tracking her every movement, analyzing, calculating, waiting, because somewhere not far away, a man leaned forward in silence, his voice low and almost curious as he watched her walk into the rain with something she could have easily kept, something most people would have, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't look bored, he looked interested, as if the outcome of this single moment mattered more than any boardroom deal or billion-dollar contract, and he whispered to no one in particular, "Let's see how far your honesty goes," while Chloe kept walking, unaware that the choice she had just made, simple and quiet as it was, had already changed everything. The rain did not let up as Chloe moved deeper into the city, each block stretching longer than the last, her step steady but slow as the cold seeped further into her skin, yet she kept her hand pressed lightly against her jacket where the wallet rested, as if making sure it was still there, still safe, not because she feared losing it, but because it now carried a weight far beyond its leather and cash. It carried a decision she had already made and could not take back, and every passing storefront window reflected a version of her that looked smaller than the world around it, soaked hair, tired eyes, a figure most people would glance past without a second thought, but tonight, she walked with a quiet sense of purpose that did not match her circumstances, and somewhere far above street level, behind tinted glass and glowing monitors, Adrian Wolfe watched her progress in silence, his fingers resting lightly on the edge of a sleek desk as multiple camera feeds shifted with her movement, each angle capturing a different fragment of her journey, the hesitation in her shoulders when she paused at a crosswalk, the way she adjusted her jacket to shield the wallet from the rain, the brief glance she gave to a brightly lit diner window where people sat warm and dry, laughing over plates of food she could almost smell from the sidewalk, and still, she kept walking, and Adrian's gaze sharpened slightly, not with surprise, but with something closer to curiosity, because most people did not last this long in a test they did not even know they were taking, and he leaned back just slightly, his voice calm, almost detached, as if narrating a pattern he had seen 100 times before. Hunger changes people, he said quietly, though no one responded, it always does, and yet, Chloe turned away from the diner window without stepping inside, her stomach tightening as she forced herself forward, focusing instead on the name she had memorized from the license, repeating it silently in her mind as if it were a destination she could not afford to forget, and the address that followed, somewhere in a part of the city she rarely crossed into, a place where the sidewalks were cleaner, the buildings taller, and the air itself seemed to carry a different kind of weight, and as she walked, the city around her began to shift, the flickering streetlights replaced by steady illumination, the cracked pavement smoothing into polished concrete, the noise fading into something softer, more controlled, and Chloe felt it immediately, that subtle change that told her she was stepping into a world that was not meant for her, but she did not slow down, did not turn back, because the decision had already been made the moment she closed the wallet, and there was no version of this night where she kept it without losing something more important in return, even if she could not quite put that feeling into words. And when she finally stopped in front of a tall glass building, its entrance glowing under bright white lights, she hesitated for just a second, her reflection staring back at her from the polished surface, rain-soaked and out of place, and she exhaled slowly, brushing a damp strand of hair away from her face before stepping forward, her shoes quiet against the clean ground as she approached the door, and inside, a security guard glanced up briefly, his expression shifting from routine indifference to mild confusion as he took in her appearance, but Chloe met his gaze with a calm that surprised even herself, reaching into her jacket and pulling out the wallet, holding it carefully in both hands as if presenting proof of something that mattered. I think this belongs to someone here, she said, her voice steady despite the cold, and the guard hesitated, glancing between her and the wallet before stepping forward, taking it cautiously as if unsure what to make of the situation. Where did you find this? He asked, and Chloe shrugged lightly, water dripping from her sleeve. On the street, near a car, she replied simply, not adding anything more, not asking for anything in return, and for a moment, the lobby seemed to hold its breath, the quiet hum of lights filling the space as the guard looked down at the wallet again, then back at her, something unreadable in his expression, while far above, Adrian leaned forward once more, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched the exchange unfold in real time, because this was the moment that usually broke people, the moment where expectation crept in, where they asked for something, anything, a reward, a thank you, a recognition that they had done something rare, but Chloe just stood there, hands now empty, her shoulders slightly hunched from the cold, waiting only long enough to be sure the wallet was no longer her responsibility, and then she gave a small nod, almost to herself, before turning toward the door, already preparing to step back into the rain, and Adrian's lips parted just slightly, not in disbelief, but in something quieter, something more dangerous, because for the first time, the pattern did not follow the script he knew so well, and as Chloe pushed the door open and the cold air rushed in again, he spoke under his breath, softer this time, almost thoughtful, interesting. The door closed behind Chloe with a soft click, sealing the warmth of the building away as the cold night air wrapped around her again, sharper this time, as if reminding her exactly where she belonged, and for a brief second she stood there under the awning, the rain cascading just inches beyond her reach, her hands empty now, lighter in a way that did not quite match the heaviness settling in her chest, because returning the wallet had not changed anything about her reality. She was still cold, still hungry, still without a place to go, and yet there was something steady beneath it all, a quiet sense that she had done what she was supposed to do, even if no one would ever know, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself before stepping back into the rain, her shoes splashing softly as she moved away from the bright entrance and back into the darker streets, unaware that inside the building, the security guard was still standing in place, staring down at the wallet in his hand before quickly reaching for his radio, his voice low but urgent as he called it in, and within seconds, the quiet lobby shifted into motion, not chaotic, but precise, controlled, as if every step had already been planned, and upstairs, Adrian Wolfe did not move for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the screen showing Chloe walking away, smaller with each step, until she blended into the rhythm of the city again, just another figure disappearing into the night, and he exhaled slowly, a faint crease forming between his brows, not from confusion, but from something more unfamiliar, something he did not immediately categorize, because the outcome had not followed the usual pattern. There had been no hesitation at the end, no lingering expectation, no request for reward. She had simply left, and that absence of demand echoed louder than any words could have, and finally, he stood, straightening his jacket with a deliberate calm before speaking into the quiet room. "Get me everything on her," his voice steady, controlled, but carrying an edge that had not been there before, and within moments, screens shifted, data pulling together piece by piece, fragments of a life that had been largely invisible until now, scattered records, old addresses, brief employment histories that ended too soon, and then nothing, long stretches of absence that spoke louder than any documented detail, and Adrian watched it all with a focused intensity, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk as he absorbed each piece, constructing an image not just of who she was, but of what she had endured. And still, none of it explained what he had just seen, because hardship alone did not create integrity. If anything, it usually eroded it, and yet she had held on to something most people lost long before reaching that point, and that contradiction lingered in his mind as he turned back to the live feed, tracking her again as she moved through the city, now slower, her steps heavier as the night wore on, and Chloe, for her part, felt every inch of the distance now, the adrenaline of her decision fading as exhaustion settled in, her stomach tightening with each passing block as the rain soaked deeper into her clothes, but she kept moving, not toward anything in particular, just forward, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling the full weight of everything she did not have, and she was not ready for that tonight, not after choosing to give something up, even if it had never truly been hers, and eventually, she found herself beneath the dim cover of a bus stop, its cracked plastic panels offering just enough shelter to break the direct fall of rain, and she sank onto the cold bench with a quiet exhale, her hands rubbing together for warmth as she stared out at the empty street, the city quieter now, slower, as if even it needed to rest, and for a moment, she allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a second, just long enough to breathe, to exist without moving, and she almost missed the sound of footsteps approaching, soft but deliberate, until a shadow shifted at the edge of her vision, and she opened her eyes again, her body tensing slightly out of instinct. But the figure that stepped into the faint light did not look threatening, just another man. Caught in the same rain, his coat damp, his posture relaxed, his expression unreadable in the low glow, and he stopped a few feet away, not too close, not intrusive, just enough to share the shelter, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between strangers who had no reason to trust each other, and yet something about the stillness felt different this time, as if the night itself was holding its breath again, waiting for what would happen next, while somewhere not far away, unseen and unnoticed, a camera adjusted its angle ever so slightly, capturing the moment from above as Adrian watched with quiet focus, his voice barely a whisper as he leaned closer to the screen. "Let us see what you do now." The rain softened to a steady drizzle, tapping lightly against the cracked plastic roof of the bus stop as Chloe kept her eyes forward, aware of the man beside her without turning to look at him, her body instinctively guarded but not alarmed, because there was something measured in the way he stood, not too close, not too distant, as if he understood the invisible boundaries people like her relied on to feel safe, and for a long moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them in a way that felt almost deliberate, until he finally shifted slightly, his shoes scraping softly against the damp concrete as he glanced toward the empty street, then back toward her, his voice calm, and even when he broke the quiet, long night, he said, not as a question, but as a simple observation, and Chloe let out a faint breath that almost sounded like a quiet laugh, though there was no humor in it. Just recognition, they usually are, she replied, her voice steady despite the cold, and she kept her gaze fixed ahead, watching the faint glow of headlights in the distance fade in and out like distant signals she had no intention of chasing, and the man nodded slightly, as if that answer told him more than it should have, and he slipped his hands into his coat pockets, his posture relaxed, almost casual, though his eyes remained sharp, observant, taking in the small details most people ignored, the way her jacket was too thin for the weather, the way her shoes were worn at the edges, the way she rubbed her hands together not just for warmth, but to keep feeling in her fingers, and for a moment, he said nothing else, as if giving her space to exist without pressure, before speaking again, his tone just curious enough to sound natural. You live around here, and Chloe hesitated, just for a second, the question simple on the surface but layered beneath, because answering it meant admitting something she did not always say out loud. And she shrugged lightly instead, her shoulders rising and falling in a small, controlled motion. I get by, she said, not defensive, not ashamed, just factual, and the man watched her carefully, noting the absence of bitterness in her voice, the lack of resentment that often colored answers like that, and he tilted his head slightly, as if considering something before continuing. That building back there, he added casually, gesturing faintly in the direction she had come from. You walked out pretty fast, and Chloe finally turned her head just enough to glance at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, not in suspicion, but in quiet curiosity. Returned something that did not belong to me, she said. Simply, her tone leaving no room for interpretation, and the man's lips curved just slightly, not quite a smile, more like acknowledgement, as if he had been expecting that answer, and he let out a soft breath, his gaze drifting toward the rain again. Most people would have kept it, he said, his voice low, almost thoughtful, and Chloe looked away again, her expression unreadable as she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Most people are not standing out here with nothing, she replied. Her words quiet but carrying weight, and for a moment, the air between them shifted, the simplicity of her statement cutting through whatever assumptions might have been lingering beneath the surface, and the man absorbed that, his eyes flickering with something deeper now, something less analytical and more human, though he masked it quickly, his voice steady as he spoke again. And you still gave it back, he said, not pressing, just stating a fact. And Chloe exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cold air as she stared at the wet pavement, the reflection of the streetlight trembling with each drop of rain. If I start taking what is not mine, she said quietly, almost to herself, then I lose the only thing I have left. And the words hung there for a second, heavier than anything she had said before, and the man did not respond immediately, because for the first time since he had stepped into the shelter, he did not have a prepared angle, no immediate follow-up that fit neatly into a test or observation. And somewhere above them, unseen, the camera captured the moment in perfect clarity, the subtle shift in his posture, the brief pause that broke his usual rhythm. And Adrian Wolf, watching from behind the screen, leaned in just slightly, his eyes narrowing not in suspicion, but in something closer to realization, because this was not a performance, not something she was saying for approval or recognition, it was simply the truth as she understood it. And down below, the man beside Chloe finally nodded, a slow, thoughtful motion, as if acknowledging something he could not quite argue with. And the rain continued to fall around them, steady and quiet, as the city moved on without noticing either of them, two strangers sharing a moment that neither fully understood yet, but that was already beginning to change the direction of everything. The silence after her words lingered longer than either of them expected, not uncomfortable, but heavy in a way that settled deep, like something true had just been placed between them and neither one wanted to disturb it too quickly. And the man shifted his weight slightly, his gaze lowering for a brief moment as if he was replaying what she had said, measuring it against something internal, something far removed from this quiet bus stop and the cold night air. And Chloe returned her attention to the empty street, her posture relaxing just a fraction now that the conversation had slowed, though her hands still moved lightly against each other for warmth. the faint tremor in her fingers betraying the exhaustion she had been holding back, and after a few seconds, the man reached into his coat pocket, the motion subtle and unhurried, and when his hand emerged, it held a small, neatly wrapped granola bar. The kind sold in convenience stores, simple and unremarkable, but in this moment, it might as well have been something far more valuable, and he extended it toward her without stepping closer, his arms stopping halfway between them, offering but not imposing. "You should eat," he said, his voice even, without pity, without expectation, and Chloe's eyes shifted to the bar, then back to his face, studying him for a brief second as if trying to understand the intention behind the gesture. Because nothing in her world came without some kind of trade, some kind of unspoken cost. And she hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly against her sleeve. "I cannot pay you back," she said quietly, not rejecting it, just stating a boundary she had learned to set, and the man shook his head once, a small, almost dismissive motion. "It is not a loan," he replied, and there was something in the way he said it, something steady and certain, that made her pause just a second longer before she reached out, her hand brushing his lightly as she took the bar. The contact brief but real, grounding in a way she did not expect, and she nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, before unwrapping it carefully, her movements slow, deliberate, as if she was making it last even before taking the first bite, and when she did, the relief was immediate, subtle but undeniable, her body responding before her mind could catch up, and she closed her eyes for just a second, not out of indulgence, but out of simple gratitude for something warm and solid in her stomach, and the man watched her, not staring, not intrusive, just observing, his expression unreadable but softer now, as if the lines of calculation had eased slightly, and above them, unseen, the camera continued to capture every detail, the small exchange, the shift in posture, the quiet acceptance of something given freely, and Adrian Wolfe leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled lightly in front of him as he watched himself on the screen, watched the way he had offered the food without thinking too much about it, the way she had hesitated but not refused, and something about that exchange lingered with him longer than he expected, because it was not part of the original test, not something he had planned or structured, it was simply a moment that had happened, and that lack of control unsettled him more than any predictable outcome ever had. And back at the bus stop, Chloe finished the granola bar slowly, folding the wrapper neatly in her hand instead of dropping it, a habit that spoke of a kind of order she refused to lose, even in a life that had none, and she glanced at him again, her expression quieter now, less guarded. "Thank you," she said, the words simple but sincere, and he inclined his head slightly, accepting it without comment, and for a moment, they sat in silence again, the rain easing into a lighter mist, the sound soft and almost distant now, and then Chloe shifted slightly on the bench, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the street where the faint outline of a bus approached, its headlights cutting through the damp air, and she straightened just a little, her attention sharpening, not because she expected to board it, but because it represented movement, direction, something beyond standing still, and the man followed her gaze, then looked back at her, something unreadable passing through his eyes before he spoke again, quieter this time. "Where will you go next?" And Chloe shrugged lightly, though there was less uncertainty in the motion than before. "Somewhere dry," she answered, and there was a faint hint of determination in her voice now, small but present, as if even the smallest kindness had shifted something inside her just enough to keep moving forward, and the bus slowed. As it approached, its brakes hissing softly as it came to a stop a few yards away, the doors opening with a mechanical sigh, and for a brief moment, neither of them moved, the opportunity hanging there between them, simple and clear, and then Chloe stood, pulling her jacket tighter around herself as she stepped toward the bus, not looking back immediately, not expecting anything more from the night than what had already been given, and behind her, the man remained still for just a second longer, before rising as well, his gaze following her with a focus that had shifted from curiosity to something deeper, something more personal, as if this was no longer just about watching what she would do, but about understanding why she did it at all. The bus doors remained open for only a moment, the warm yellow light spilling onto the wet pavement like an invitation that did not last long, and Chloe paused just at the edge of it, her foot hovering slightly above the first step as reality caught up with instinct, because buses required exact fare, and she had none, not even $1, not even loose change hidden in a forgotten pocket, and for a brief second, something flickered across her face. Not embarrassment, not quite disappointment, but a quiet acceptance of a truth she had lived with long enough to recognize instantly, and she stepped back, letting the moment pass without making a scene, without asking, without explaining, as if it had never been an option to begin with, and the driver barely glanced at her before closing the doors with a soft mechanical hiss, the bus pulling away into the night, leaving behind only the fading glow of its taillights and the steady rhythm of rain against concrete. And Chloe exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just slightly as she turned away from the curb, already preparing to continue on foot, because that was what she always did, keep moving, adjust, adapt, survive. And behind her, the man had seen everything, the hesitation, the almost step forward, the silent retreat, and something shifted in his expression, subtle but unmistakable, as if a line he had not realized was there had just been crossed, and without hesitation, he reached into his coat again, his fingers brushing against a folded bill, but he stopped before pulling it out, his hand stilling as he reconsidered, because this was no longer just about solving a problem, it was about how, and why, and whether she would accept it, and he stepped forward instead, closing the small distance between them just enough to speak without raising his voice. "Wait," he said, and Chloe turned slightly, her eyes meeting his with a quiet question, and he held her gaze for a second before continuing, his tone steady but different now, less observational, more direct. "You were going to take the bus," he said, not accusing, just stating what he had seen, and Chloe gave a small shrug, her lips pressing together briefly before she answered. "It does not matter," she replied, her voice calm, as if the moment had already passed for her, and the man studied her for a second longer, then shook his head slightly, a faint exhale escaping him as he reached into his pocket again, this time pulling out a crisp $20 bill, holding it between his fingers but not extending it immediately. "It matters," he said quietly, and Chloe's eyes dropped to the bill, then lifted back to his face, her expression tightening just slightly, not out of offense, but out of something more complex, something rooted in pride and survival. "I cannot take that," she said, her voice firm but not harsh, and he nodded once, as if he had expected that answer, his hand lowering slightly but not withdrawing. "Why not?" he asked, not challenging, just curious, and Chloe hesitated, searching for the simplest way to explain something that was not simple at all. "Because I did not earn it," she said finally, the words quiet but grounded, and for a moment, the rain seemed to fade into the background again, the space between them narrowing not physically, but in understanding, and the man looked at her, really looked this time, not as part of a test, not as a subject to observe, but as a person whose logic did not fit neatly into his expectations, and he considered her answer carefully before speaking again, his tone shifting slightly, softer, more deliberate. "You earned it when you walked that wallet back instead of keeping it," he said, and the words landed between them with a weight that neither of them could ignore, and Chloe blinked, just once, the statement catching her off guard in a way she had not anticipated, because she had not done it to earn anything, she had done it because she believed she had to, and that difference mattered to her. "That was not for money," she replied, her voice steady but carrying a hint of something deeper now, something protective, and the man nodded again, slower this time, acknowledging the boundary she was drawing, and he lowered the bill completely, slipping it back into his pocket without argument, without pushing further, and that alone shifted something in the air, because most people would have insisted, would have tried to convince her, would have turned it into something she owed, but he did not, he simply accepted it, and for a moment, they stood there again, the rain falling softer now, the city quieter, and then he spoke once more, his voice calm, almost casual, but with an undercurrent that had not been there before. "Then let me give you something you can earn," he said, and Chloe's gaze sharpened slightly, her attention shifting fully back to him, curiosity replacing the earlier hesitation. "What do you mean?" she asked, and he held her gaze for a second, as if weighing his next words carefully, before answering. "A place to stay tonight," he said, not rushed, not persuasive, just clear. "You help me with something small, and I help you in return," and Chloe studied him in silence, her mind moving quickly beneath the stillness of her expression, measuring risk, intention, possibility, because offers like that were rarely simple, rarely safe, and yet something about the way he said it, the absence of pressure, the absence of expectation beyond the exchange itself, made her pause instead of walking away, and above them, unseen, the camera captured the moment perfectly, the shift from observation to interaction, from test to something far less controlled, and Adrian Wolfe, watching it all unfold, did not speak this time, because for the first time since this began, he was not entirely sure. What would happen next? Chloe did not answer right away, the offer settling between them like something fragile that could either hold or break depending on how she moved next, and she studied him carefully now, really looking past the surface, past the calm tone and measured posture, searching for the part that did not match the words, because there was always a part like that, something hidden beneath what people chose to show, and she had learned the hard way that trusting too quickly came with a cost she could not afford again, and the rain continued to fall around them, softer now, almost like a whisper against the pavement, as if the world itself had quieted to hear her decision, and the man did not rush her, did not fill the silence with explanations or reassurances, he simply stood there, steady, giving her the space to think, and that alone made her hesitate longer than she expected, because pressure she knew how to resist. But patience was different, patience made things feel real, and she finally spoke, her voice low but clear, "What kind of help?" And he gave a small nod, as if acknowledging the question rather than answering it immediately, his gaze shifting briefly toward the street before returning to her. "Nothing complicated," he said, his tone even. "I need someone to deliver something in the morning, early, before most places open," and Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, not suspicious, but focused, weighing the simplicity of his words against the reality she understood. "Why me?" she asked, and the question hung there, direct and unfiltered, because she was not interested in vague answers or half-truths, and for a moment, he almost smiled, not out of amusement, but because the question itself was exactly what he would have expected from someone who thought carefully before stepping forward, and he met her gaze without hesitation. "Because you returned something that was not yours when you could have kept it," he said, and there was no hesitation in his voice, no performance, just a statement that felt grounded in what he had seen, and Chloe held his gaze a second longer, searching for doubt, for manipulation, for anything that would tell her to walk away, but there was none, at least not in the way she had learned to recognize, and she exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the cool air as she considered it, the weight of the night pressing against her shoulders, the exhaustion, the cold, the memory of that brief moment of warmth from the granola bar still lingering, and the idea of a place to sleep, even just for one night, pulled at something deeper than logic, something closer to survival. But she did not move yet, because survival had rules, and she had learned to follow them carefully. "And that is it?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "No other conditions," and he shook his head once, a simple, controlled motion. "That is it," he replied, and then, after a brief pause, he added, "You do the job, you get a room, no questions, no obligations after that," and Chloe listened to the words, letting them settle, testing them against her instincts. And for a moment, she imagined saying no, imagined turning away and continuing down the street, finding another bench, another shelter, another night that blurred into the next, and she knew she could do it. She had done it before, but something about this felt different, not because of him, but because of the choice in front of her, the possibility of stepping into something temporary but real, something earned, and she finally nodded, once, small but certain. "All right," she said, and the word carried more weight than it seemed, because it was not just agreement, it was a decision to trust, even if only a little, even if only for one night, and the man's expression shifted just slightly, not relief, not victory, but something closer to acknowledgement, as if he understood what it had taken for her to say yes, and he reached into his coat again, this time pulling out a small card, plain, clean, with an address printed in simple black text, and he held it out to her the same way he had offered the food, steady, without pressure, and Chloe took it carefully, her fingers brushing the surface as she read it quickly, committing it to memory almost immediately, and she looked back up at him, her eyes sharper now, more focused. "What time?" she asked, and he met her gaze, his voice calm and precise. "6 in the morning," he said, "be there, and we will go from there," and Chloe nodded again, slipping the card into her jacket as if it were something valuable, something that could not be lost, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the agreement settling into place without ceremony, without anything more than what had already been said, and then he stepped back slightly, creating distance again, as if returning the space he had briefly crossed. "You should find somewhere to stay until then," he added, not as an instruction, but as a simple observation, and Chloe gave a faint nod, her mind already shifting toward the next step, the next move, the path that would carry her from this moment into whatever came next, and as she turned to leave, her figure fading once more into the quiet rhythm of the city, she did not see the way his expression changed when she was no longer looking, the way his eyes followed her with a depth that no longer belonged to a test or an experiment, and somewhere above, behind glass and screens, Adrian Wolfe stood very still, watching the version of himself that had just stepped beyond observation and into something far more unpredictable, and for the first time, the question was no longer what she would do next, but what he would become because of it. The city felt different just before dawn, quieter in a way that did not belong to the night anymore but had not yet given itself to the day, and Chloe walked through it with a pace that was steady but purposeful, her mind sharper than it had been hours ago despite the lack of sleep, because something about having a direction, even a temporary one, changed the way exhaustion settled in her body. And the small card in her jacket pocket felt heavier than it should have, not because of what it was, but because of what it represented, a choice she had made, a line she had stepped across, and she reached the address just minutes before 6, standing across the street for a moment as she took it in, the building rising clean and polished against the pale gray sky, its glass exterior reflecting the first hints of morning light, and it was not the kind of place she would normally approach, not without reason, not without hesitation. But today she had both, and she crossed the street, her steps quiet against the smooth pavement as she approached the entrance, her reflection meeting her again in the glass, still damp, still worn, but standing a little straighter than the night before, and as she pushed the door open, the warmth inside wrapped around her instantly, the air carrying that subtle scent of clean floors and quiet order, and a receptionist behind the desk looked up, her expression shifting slightly as she took in Chloe's appearance. But before she could speak, Chloe stepped forward, her voice calm and clear. "I am here for a delivery job," she said, holding the card lightly between her fingers as proof, and the receptionist glanced at it, then at her again, something flickering in her eyes before she nodded and reached for a phone, speaking quietly into it, and within seconds, the rhythm of the building shifted just slightly, subtle movements that most people would not notice, but Chloe felt it, the way attention redirected, the way the space adjusted around her presence, and then the elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped out, the same man from the night before, but different now, not in appearance, but in the way the space responded to him, the way the receptionist straightened just a little, the way the air seemed to align itself around his presence, and Chloe saw it immediately, the shift that did not need words to explain, and her gaze sharpened as he approached, his expression calm, composed, as if nothing had changed, and yet everything had, and he stopped a few feet in front of her, his eyes meeting hers with the same steady focus, but there was something beneath it now, something that had not been there at the bus stop, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence carrying a different weight than before, and then Chloe broke it, her voice quiet but direct. "You did not tell me this is your building," she said, not accusing, but not ignoring it either, and he inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the truth without hesitation. "I did not," he replied, and that was all he said, no explanation, no justification, just the fact itself, and Chloe held his gaze, searching for something more, something that would clarify the difference between the man from the night and the man standing in front of her now, and she found it not in his words, but in the way he did not avoid the question, did not deflect, did not pretend otherwise, and she exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening slightly around the card before she lowered it. "So what is this really?" she asked, and there was no fear in her voice, just clarity, because she understood now that this was not just a simple exchange, not just a delivery job, and he watched her carefully, the moment stretching just long enough to matter before he answered. "It is exactly what I said," he replied, his tone steady, "a job you can earn," and then, after a brief pause, he added, "but it is also a choice," and Chloe's eyes narrowed slightly, the words settling into place as she processed them, because a choice meant more than a task, it meant consequence, it meant direction, and she stood there for a second longer, the quiet of the lobby pressing in around them as the early morning light grew stronger through the glass walls, and she realized something then, something simple but undeniable. She was no longer being watched from a distance, no longer part of something she did not understand, she was standing inside it now, part of whatever came next, and she lifted her chin just slightly, her posture aligning with that realization. "Then tell me what I have to do," she said. And her voice carried a quiet strength that had not been there the night before, and the man met her gaze, his expression shifting almost imperceptibly, not into a smile, but into something closer to respect, and he nodded once, a small, deliberate motion, as if accepting not just her words, but the person standing in front of him, and somewhere deep within the building, unseen and unheard, systems moved, doors unlocked, paths prepared, because this moment, quiet as it seemed, had already set something much larger into motion, something that would not be undone by a simple decision. And as Chloe stood there, waiting for his answer, she did not yet know that the truth behind all of this was still just out of reach, waiting for the moment when everything would finally be revealed. Adrian did not answer immediately, not because he did not know what to say, but because for the first time in a long time, he was choosing his words with care rather than precision, and he gestured lightly toward the elevator behind him, his tone calm but grounded in something that felt different now. "Come with me," he said, and Chloe hesitated only for a second before stepping forward. The quiet hum of the building surrounding them as the elevator doors slid open and they stepped inside, the space enclosed but not uncomfortable, the soft lighting reflecting off polished surfaces as the doors closed and the city outside disappeared behind steel and glass. And as the elevator began to rise, Chloe felt it again, that subtle shift, not just in height, but in where she stood in all of this, no longer outside looking in, but moving upward into something she did not fully understand yet. And she glanced at Adrian, her eyes steady, searching, while he remained composed, his posture relaxed, but his focus entirely on her, as if this moment mattered more than anything waiting at the top. And when the doors opened again, it was into a quiet office space, wide and clean, with floor-to-ceiling windows that revealed the city stretching out below, now touched by the first light of morning. And Chloe stepped out slowly, her gaze taking in the view, the height, the difference between where she had been just hours ago and where she stood now. And Adrian followed, stopping a few feet away as he watched her reaction, not with pride, not with expectation, but with something closer to awareness, as if he understood the weight of the contrast. And after a moment, he spoke, his voice steady. "The delivery is simple," he said, placing a small sealed envelope on the desk between them. "You take this to a community center across town, you hand it directly to the director, no one else." And Chloe turned her attention back to him, her eyes narrowing slightly as she listened, absorbing every detail, every instruction, because simple did not always mean easy. And she nodded once, committing it to memory. "And that is all?" she asked, and Adrian held her gaze for a second before answering. "That is all," he said, and then, after a brief pause, he added, "But before you go, there is something you should know." And Chloe felt the shift immediately, not in his words, but in the tone beneath them, something heavier, something that carried more than just the task in front of her. And she did not move, did not speak, she simply waited, her attention fully on him now. And Adrian exhaled slowly, his eyes flickering briefly toward the city outside before returning to her. And when he spoke again, his voice was quieter, not weaker, but more honest. "Stripped of the control he usually carried, the wallet you returned," he said. "It was not lost," and the words settled into the room with a quiet finality. And Chloe's expression did not change immediately, but something in her posture tightened just slightly, her mind moving quickly. As the pieces began to shift into place, and she did not interrupt, did not react outwardly, she simply listened. And Adrian continued, his gaze steady on hers. "I left it there," he said, "on purpose." And now the silence that followed was different, no longer neutral, no longer waiting, but charged with understanding. And Chloe's eyes sharpened, not with anger, but with clarity, the kind that cut through everything else. And she took a small step back, not retreating, but creating space. "You were testing people," she said, her voice calm but firm. And Adrian nodded once, accepting it without hesitation. "Yes," he replied. And for a moment, neither of them spoke, the truth sitting between them, heavier than anything before it. And Chloe let out a slow breath, her gaze dropping briefly to the envelope on the desk, then lifting again to meet his. And when she spoke, her voice carried something new, something stronger. "You were not testing kindness," she said quietly, "you were trying to prove it does not exist." And the words landed harder than anything else she had said, not because they were loud, but because they were precise. And Adrian felt it, the accuracy of it, the way it cut through his assumptions, his patterns, his need to control outcomes, and for the first time, he did not have an immediate response, because she was not wrong, and Chloe watched him for a second longer, her expression steady, not accusing, not emotional, just clear, and she nodded once, almost to herself, as if confirming something she had already begun to understand, and she reached for the envelope, her fingers closing around it with quiet certainty. "I will deliver this," she said, her voice calm, "because I agreed to it," and she held his gaze for just a moment longer before adding, "but not because of your test," and then she turned, moving toward the door without hesitation, her step steady, grounded in her own decision rather than anything he had created, and Adrian watched her go, something shifting deep within him, something he could not dismiss or analyze away, because for the first time, the result of his test was not data, not confirmation, it was a challenge, a reflection of something he had refused to believe in, and as the door closed behind her, leaving the office quiet once more, he remained still, his gaze lingering on the space she had just occupied, and the city beyond the glass seemed different now, not because it had changed, but because he had, even if only slightly, even if only enough to recognize that what he had been searching for all along was not something to test, but something to trust, and somewhere below, Chloe stepped back into the morning light, the envelope held securely in her hand, moving forward not because she had been chosen, but because she had chosen herself. And that made all the difference.